The Old Testament reading is from Genesis. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers." He said, "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." The man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks. In my decade as a youth minister, I quickly learned the most dangerous and controversial and frankly inappropriate phrase to use around teenagers. "You look just like your dad." It carries the same emotional volatility of telling your spouse, "You're just like your mother." As it turns out, teenagers are trying to establish their own identities. And they don't love being told that they're carbon copies of their parents. Have no fear, the great family systems expert Edwin Friedman says that this process is called self-differentiation, and it's very natural, and it's very healthy, and it's very important for teenagers. But what we're resisting is the reality that our parents and family systems imprint on us in ways that we might not want to recognize. My dad has this habit of cleaning his teeth by shooting air through his teeth after a meal. You know what I mean? Like that, doing that, you know? Much to my surprise, Nora was quick to point out that I actually do this also, and oftentimes unconsciously. We were watching TV yesterday, and she said, you're doing the thing that you're talking about in your sermon tomorrow." So, I am my father's son, what can I say? Our family systems, though, they're not just limited to our nuclear families. Our communities, our neighborhoods imprint on us. We have regional and national identities that imprint on us. We inherit this imprinting. We inherit imaginations that are shaped either by kindness and creativity, or we inherit imaginations that are twisted by our unrepentant pasts of violence, systemic racism, and white supremacy. In my own body reside the DNA of both my great-great-grandfather in Arkansas, who was hanged on his front lawn for supporting the Union, hanged by Confederate soldiers on one side of my family, but on the other side of my family is the DNA of one of the bodyguards of Jefferson Davis, the rebel-proclaimed president of the Confederacy. So I can either whitewash my past and glorify it and tell some false narrative about what it means, or I can ignore it and pretend like it's not really me and my history doesn't repeat itself, or I can repent and let the light of the resurrection of Jesus Christ heal me and the sins of my fathers. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And from our parents, our parents and our pasts, we inherit the good, the bad, and the ugly. And just like Jacob's sons in our text today, we all carry the sins of our fathers. Our text today opens on Joseph and his father Jacob's family system, which consisted of 2 sister wives, their 2 slaves that he impregnates, 12 sons, and 1 daughter who's actually named Dinah. Hardly a family to emulate. Jacob's first wife, Leah, is sold into marriage by her father Laban, who tricks Jacob into marrying the daughters, and Rachel, who he loves, but Leah, who he does not. And Leah cries out to God for a child to alleviate the pain of her loveless marriage, and she is given the firstborn son in the family, Reuben. Leah and Rachel begin to compete for position in the family, and both offer their slaves, Bilhah and Zilpah, to Jacob to produce more children. As the family grew and grew, so did the tensions became different factions, and especially when Rachel, the wife who Jacob worked 14 years to marry, had her first son, Joseph, Jacob's beloved and favorite child. How does that sound? Favorite child. If you don't know where the story's going, you can probably guess how Jacob's favoritism went down with the rest of the family. Nothing brings a family together like ranking your children, right? This is a dangerous game. This is a dangerous game that Jacob plays, but thanks be to God that the story of God's work in the world doesn't end with Jacob's family system. It is descriptive but not prescriptive to how we are to live. But in the words of Peter the Apostle, after he met the Roman soldier Cornelius, truly I can see that God shows no partiality. God's parenting strategy is very different from Jacob's. So Jacob does what parents do when they don't know how to express affection. He buys his favorite son a bunch of stuff, right? I guess his love language is gift giving and acts of service or something like that. So he gives Joseph his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, as we know. Actually, in the translation in the RSV, it just says, a coat with long sleeves, which is still something that is worn today. It's called a thwab, is the Arabic word for garment. And it's that long-sleeved, long white linen outfit that you see a lot of Middle Eastern men wearing. And it keeps the solar glare off your skin, but it's also, in this system, the worker's job is to get hot. The boss's job is to stay cool and tell the workers what to do. So when Jacob gives Joseph, his favorite son, his coat of many colors, his coat with long sleeves, the brothers know exactly what he's doing. Joseph is our boss. And Jacob is up to his old tricks of putting the later born sons ahead of the oldest. And then you notice in verse 4, the brothers begin to hate Joseph. And it says they could not speak peaceably to him. And sibling strife sparked, screamed in his ear, sunk in his heart. Be better, go faster, jump higher, run longer. Let your brother be the enemy. Let your sister be the stick by which you compare and contrast. Such venom outlasts, and peace won't pass from generation to generation until every last sin of the father is forgiven. The venom of Cain is still running deep in the veins of Jacob's children. Why do the brothers choose to hate Joseph instead of Jacob? Jacob's the one who set the system up this way. It's so easy to blame our peers and our neighbors and our brothers and our sisters than it is to be honest and acknowledge and confess the sins of our fathers, because blame and hate spread better than they rise. Justo Gonzalez is widely regarded as one of the finest living church historians. He wrote a work that's one of my favorite books called Mañana, a Christian theology from a Hispanic perspective. And he talks about this tendency of American Christians to whitewash our heroes. And he takes two colonial traditions to discuss this: the Pilgrims and the Conquistadors. Many Americans, we claim the Puritan Pilgrims as our source of ancestry. If not biologically, this is the story that we live by. Noble people seeking religious freedom from persecution travel the Atlantic Sea to find liberty and freedom to worship God the way that they want to. And we glorify our founding fathers in light of puritanical purity and moral fortitude. And we choose to ignore the realities. Many of them owned people. They owned slaves. Even though we would read a text like Genesis 37 and we would shudder at the cruelty of Jacob's sons selling their brother into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. And today we call that human trafficking. And there are more slaves on planet Earth today than there were during the transatlantic slave trade. Let that fact sink in. But Dr. Gonzalez points out that our Puritan roots afford us the luxury to proclaim moral superiority so that we either crucify our flawed leaders when they fail to live up to our standards, or we completely ignore the moral decay and decadence of our other leaders. When it comes to our heroes, we can be masters of self-deception. When we're honest about our history, though, we're not shaming our ancestors. We're honoring their legacy by learning from their mistakes. Because what father, if you asked him, wouldn't want his daughters and sons to learn from his sins, to not make his mistakes? According to Dr. Gonzalez, Latin American Christians, with their colonial ancestors, were the conquistadors, violent men of war, fueled by blood and treasure with little regard to the judgments of history or God. And the children of conquistadors understand how complicated and complex these biblical patriarchs are. They possess no puritanical need to whitewash their cultural history nor the biblical history. And it's precisely in a moment like this where white folks desperately need to hear the voices of people of color, people whose experience, people whose reality is so different from our own. Because as a white man, I don't fear the police. And as an American citizen, I don't fear soldiers coming in the night to steal my children. And while some men in our country use fear and hate and turn fear-mongering into a commercial enterprise to sell goods and make money, I have only God and my neighbor to fear, and I'm called to love both. But I can't until I'm ready to hear both God and my neighbor, because the truth will set us free. And the truth of our narrative is that Jacob, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was a liar and a cheat and a thief and a polygamist. But you know what that makes him? Human. It makes him a sinner in need of grace, just like you and me. And we live in a world of radical individualism where it makes it difficult to confess and recognize systemic sin because it's so much bigger than me individually, and how can I be held accountable for everything? But God didn't set up the world in a way where I'm the only one that matters. We are connected into a family system as people, as Americans, as humans. I remember the first time my big brother, Cameron, chastised me for telling a racist joke. My reaction was defensive. I'm not racist. I have a black friend at school. Instead, what if my reaction had been, why did I think that was funny to begin with? Where have I failed to hear and learn and value the voices of others? But we inherit this sin. We inherit it generationally. We inherit it systemically. And just like Jacob, his family dysfunction didn't begin with him. Think back to his dad, Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah, and the half-brother of Ishmael, whose grandchildren, the Ishmaelites, in our text today, are the ones purchasing Joseph. Isaac was a younger sibling, just like me. And I love my big brother, Cameron. He's the smartest person I know. He's a history professor here in town, and he's the best dad I know. And we were growing up, I looked up to Cameron more than anyone in the world. Now think back to Genesis 21. What does it say? Sarah sees Isaac and Ishmael playing together, and she says to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for her son, this slave, shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." If my big brother Cameron had been taken away from me at such a young age, how do you think I would have felt? How would you have felt? How would Isaac feel? How do you think Abraham explained this moment to Isaac? Well, Isaac, I know you loved Ishmael, but he's a slave and you're better than him. What kind of darkness would permeate your soul? What kind of grief and entitlement would twist your young heart? We have to be taught as children how to hate. We're not born that way. Then in the next chapter, Isaac is taken up on the mountain, and Abraham begins to sacrifice him because God tells him to. But Abraham doesn't sacrifice him, as we know. But if you notice, this is the last time Isaac speaks to Abraham in the biblical text. His silence is deafening. He's just not okay anymore. In the next chapter, his mother Sarah dies. And for the next 2 chapters, Isaac is silent, and Abraham sends a servant to go find Isaac a wife, his wife Rebekah. And there their love story ends with this verse. Then Isaac brought her, Rebekah, into his mother Sarah's tent. And he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his wife's death. That's 87 verses after Sarah dies. The last person in the world that Isaac trusts. His brother has been sent away. His father tried to kill him, and his mom dies. Is it any wonder that Isaac becomes a shell of a man and is so easily manipulated by Jacob into giving away his firstborn blessing to Esau, or from Esau to Jacob? This is a broken man, and he is one of the three founders of the Judeo-Christian story. Nora is a trauma therapist, and she once shared with me a proverb from her field. A parent is deaf to their child's cries if no one has heard their own. A parent is deaf to their child's cries if no one has heard their own. Because we're doomed to pass on our generational sins, the sins of our fathers and mothers, when we fail to recognize the patterns that we inherit from them. The trauma and anxiety in Abraham's system was passed down from Isaac to Jacob and on to Jacob's children to the point where they try to murder and they sell their own brother into slavery. I used to not really like the Joseph story. I'm not really sure why still, but Joseph always struck me as this kind of like goody two-shoes, and he's tattling on his brothers at the beginning of the story. And even as a younger brother, I could tell that was annoying. But the more I read this story, the more I realize that Joseph goes through hell and in the end becomes the savior of his entire family. It's his willingness to break the cycle of violence, to forgive his brothers, to embrace them in the land of his slavery. And then Joseph transforms his family system through courage and love. This weekend, as you've heard, riots erupted in Charlottesville, Virginia, as white supremacist organizations protested the removal of Confederate statues after months of rising tension. Counter-demonstrators and religious leaders have been holding trainings in nonviolent protest in preparation for this weekend. Now, I wish that I could say that these protesters represent a minuscule fraction of infuriated white people whose inability to adapt to an economy and a world that is ever-changing has left them bitter, unskilled, and irrelevant. I wish I could say that this is the death rattle of white supremacy, one last final flare-up before the healing can set in. But tragically, this does not seem to be so. And it's time for we as white Americans to be honest with ourselves about the sins of our fathers. Our heritage is filled with hate. But that doesn't mean that our future has to be. We can learn if we will only first acknowledge that we have something to learn. We have something to learn from Black Americans. We inhabit the same soil, but we live in two very different worlds. And bridging the gap begins by saying to the people of color who are our neighbors, our colleagues, and our friends, I don't understand, but I want to. I don't believe. Help thou my unbelief. In the parking lot of the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis is a marble plaque just outside the balcony at the Lorraine Motel, where Dr. King was assassinated. And on this plaque it reads, Martin Luther King Jr., President of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They said to one another, behold, here cometh the dreamer. Let us slay him, and we shall see what becomes of his dreams. Genesis 37. It takes a dreamer to imagine a better way of being a family. It takes a dreamer to imagine a better way of being a nation. It takes a dreamer to imagine a better way of being us together. And Joseph they threw in a pit. And Dr. King they shot in cold blood in Memphis. And Jesus they nailed to a cross in Jerusalem. But we proclaim a God who does not give death the final word, who does not leave Jesus lifeless on the cross, who cradled King's crumpled corpse on the concrete of the Lorraine Motel, and who lifted Joseph out of the dusty pit of his slavery, because peace is possible if we will only listen and wake up to God's dream for the world. Amen.